All right, here we go. Chapter 4, Rooks on the 7th rank. So you may have heard this called the blind swine or pigs on the 7th, but fact of the matter is, whatever it's called, rooks on the 7th rank are devastating. 2 rooks on the 7th are just monstrous. They gobble up everything on that 7th rank, and they can make tons and tons of different checkmates. So we're going to take a look at a couple of examples. So I have this position in front of me here, 2 rooks on the 7th rank, very basic position. And here we can make a super quick checkmate if we spread the rooks out. So we start with rook takes a7, or rook to b7 would also work equally well here. We just spread those rooks out, and now no matter what black does here, we're going to get a back rank checkmate or ladder checkmate. We just zap him with one of the rooks, and in this position it could actually be either one. One rook is on 7, one rook is on 8, game over. So next up, we have a similar position, but I gave black a rook this time to sort of help him out. Now, we can't really get a back rank checkmate in the normal way. We can't play rook b8, we'll be captured. So there's another method we can use here, and this requires a helper. So here the pawn is going to be our helper, and we can force this mate with a series of checks. There's no way for black to get out of this. So we start with rook h7 check. The king must move over to g8. Then rook to g7 check. The king must move over to f8. Now notice we have this helper, so now this rook is doubly protected. So we can just jump up to the top with the other rook, and we get that same sort of ladder / back rank checkmate. Rook on 7, rook on 8, game over. And now a third example. So this time the back rank checkmate is totally out. It's not happening. We can't get up to the back rank, and on this side of the board, on the king side, there's just not enough room to sneak a rook up there. But luckily, we have another pattern we can fall back on. And a lot of times, if one pattern doesn't work, you jump to the next one. And here, we simply have a mate in 2. Rook to h7 check. King must move to g8. And then we drop in with rook on b to g7. And now we get this checkmate. Rook next to king with a helper. Both rooks are protecting each other. The king can't take either. And very, very, very important, f8 is cut off. Either one of his pieces will be blocking him, or maybe there's a bishop or a knight attacking that square so the king can't move there. So these are just some of the patterns you're going to see with these rooks on the 7th. So let's take a look at a few games, a few positions where these rooks on the 7th sort of take place. So we have another Paul Morphy game. This is Morphy versus Charles Morian. And let me jump into the middle game here. And here we actually have Morphy, who is white, with one of his rooks already on the 7th rank. So here black plays the move rook to f7, trying to get him off of the 7th rank. Morphy gives a check. The rook comes back to block. And now here comes the queen. So by the way, when I say rooks on the 7th, it can also be queens on the 7th or rook and queen on the 7th. Anything a rook can do, a queen can do. So here comes queen e7, and at this point, black brings the queen back to f7 to try to get rid of this whole attacking situation that's happening. Knight to g5, kick the queen, she takes, and now Morphy is back to 1 rook on the 7th, which is great, but we would really like to get that second rook in. So let's see how he does it. Knight to f6, and boom, we double the rooks. So we're getting ready. Now they're doubled on the e file. He really wants to have them doubled on the 7th rank. So pawn to a5 is played. Black's trying to release his rook, open the file, but Morphy just ignores it and plays rook takes c7. And rook e8 is played. Morphy was threatening to jump in there with the second rook and just go to town. So rook e8 gets played. Rook to d1. I don't want to trade rooks with you. I want to keep my rook. A takes b4. Bishop takes knight on f6. And now what this does is it clears the 7th rank. There was a pawn on g7. Now there's no pawn on g7. So this rook is even more powerful here. Knight takes h7. 7th rank is completely closed, or completely open, reverse. Rook to e6, the f6 pawn was being attacked. So the rook comes to defend, rook captures on d3, and here Morphy was threatening to just hop over to the back rank. So the bishop scoots aside, and now you can probably guess what's coming next. Here come the rooks on the 7th. So at this point, black felt pretty confident that there wasn't going to be a back rank checkmate, and the king has a lot of, well, I don't want to say a lot, but he has enough moves to sort of avoid the rooks checkmating him. So he just plays bishop c4, and now pawn to a4 is played here, a very interesting move, which allows pawn takes pawn en passant. Remember this en passant move rule. If a pawn moves 2 spaces and you have a pawn right next to it, you can basically capture it as though it's just moved 1 space. So this is what Morian does here. And now at this point, rook g7 check is played, king h8, and here's where I want you to pause your video. This is a very, very interesting move that Morphy uncorks here. He can't do the back rank mate, so he wants to do one of the other mates we just discussed. He wants to sort of trap the king, take away some of his escape squares. Pause your video and see if you can figure out how he checkmated here, what move he played. It's a funny one. Okay, here we go. So Morphy really wants to get the pattern where there's a rook on f8. If there's a black rook on f8, it blocks the king from running to the queen side. So he plays knight to f8. Look at this move. He just basically gives away a knight. And at this point, black resigns. Here's why. Well, if he takes the knight, now mission accomplished. We have the same pattern that we looked at a little bit earlier. We just play rook h7, king g8, rook g7, and he is cooked. But he doesn't have to take the knight. This is chess, it's not checkers. You don't have to take stuff. So what if he just ignores the knight and just continues, let's say, trying to promote his pawn? Well, now the knight finishes the deal here, knight to g6, and the king is totally stuck. So no matter what black did here, he was in really big trouble. So after knight f8, he just resigns. Let's see another example. This is our old friend, world champion Alexander Alyekin against Fred Dewhurst. Okay, and let me jump into the middle game here. So in this position, we see white's rook is just doing a great job on this open file. The other rook on f1 is ready to just kind of come in and double up and help his buddy out, and black is behind in development. So let's see the finish of this game. Let's see how we use rooks on the 7th to just dominate. So first things first, Alekhine, he doubles up the rooks. Bishop a6 is played. Knight jumps into e5. This is a beautiful square for this knight. This is what we call an outpost square. The knight can't be kicked out by pawns, and he's protected by a pawn here. He's just locked into position. This knight is untouchable. Rook to b8, pawn to f3, giving the king a little bit of luft, a little bit of room to escape. No back rank checkmates. Pawn to b3 is played, and black is trying very hard to get some counterplay. Black wants to open up the position, maybe try to get the rooks in somehow. So what do we do in these situations? If you see that your opponent's trying to open up the files, trying to open up the position, lock it up. Pawn to a3, and now these 2 black rooks are just shut out. h6, king f2. We're coming upon the end game. It's very important for the king to get into the game here. King h7 is played. Pawn h4, rook f8, king g3. The king is kind of advancing up the board. And now, finally, rooks on the 7th. We get the first rook in there. Now, we want to get both rooks on the 7th rank. It's not always easy. So here in this position, black plays the move bishop to b5. Rook to c5 is played. Bishop heads back. Rook to c6 is played. So just a little bit of maneuvering here. And after the move rook e8, king f4, the king goes to g8. Pawns keep advancing. Notice he's just sort of like squeezing him. And now bishop f1, pawn to g3. Bishop goes back to a6. Finally, we're ready to just get those rooks in action on the 7th rank. Here they come. Rook to f7 is played. The king can't take this rook because of the knight. Now, this is a little dangerous sometimes. Always make sure if you do something like this, the defending piece can't be removed. So here, white squared bishop can't ever get this knight. The rook can't get the knight. There are no pawns to kick the knight out of that position, so we're okay. But very often when you do stuff like this, somebody will just remove your defender and then take your rook. So watch out. Here it's perfect though. King h8 is played, and you guessed it, the rooks get doubled on the 7th rank. So now we have our beautiful doubled up rooks, party time. But black plays rook to g8, and black is rock solid here. We can't capture this pawn right now. We only have 2 attackers. Black has 2 defenders. It's not going to work. So what does Aliyegan do here? Knight d7 is played. Super weird move. You're disconnecting your rooks. And I want you to pause your video, see what he was planning here. After black plays the move king h8, what is white going to do? Why did he play the move knight to d7? What's the purpose of this move? See if you can figure it out. Okay. What is the idea? Why did we disconnect the rooks? Why did we play the move knight to d7? Here's why. We have this very, very nice move, knight to f6. Does 2 things. Number 1, it hits the rook on g8, attacks this guy, tries to get rid of him. So black just moves the rook over. Rook to f8. I want to trade rooks with you. I want your knight. This move is so logical. It makes so much sense. We have to get rid of these guys if we're black. But Aliyegan had a great plan here. He knew this move was coming. He predicted this move. And he simply plays the move rook takes on g7. Very hard move to spot because you're giving up a knight. Black plays rook to f6. And we don't have any of the checkmates that we talked about. We can't really split the rooks up and do a back rank checkmate. The back rank is well covered. And we can't do this checkmate because the f8 square isn't covered. The king can run out to f8, and if we try to back rank checkmate here, we don't have a helper. The king will just take our rook. It's looking like we're at a dead end here, but this was all planned out. Very, very nice move coming up here. We've got to solve one of these problems. Either make him cover f8 or get a helper for your rook. And here's the move that white came up with. King to e5. And now black is just completely stuck. This rook will be captured on the next move. The only way to avoid this capture is to move the rook. Well, you could move it to f7 or g6 and get captured on one of those squares. Or you could move it to f8, but now mission accomplished. We hit him with our standard double rook checkmate here, and he can't escape. And if the rook just stays there, let's make a random move for black here. We capture, and now we've got our defender. So for example, random move again, check, check, and now we can do the back rank mate because the king is guarding this rook. Boom, game over. Really great example from a world champion. Next up, Hartson versus Whiteley. So in this game, let me hop in here to the end. So in this game, we're going to see white rooks on the 7th rank. Now this is a fantastic finish. So first things first, the white rook is attacking the queen. The queen runs, and now white starts 7th rank power. Queen to h7, get onto the 7th rank. Now we have 2 attackers on this knight. We're not ready to take it just yet because black has 2 defenders. But look at this black king just hanging out in the middle of the board. No good. Rook f8 is played. By the way, we were threatening to take this rook. It looks protected. It looks defended by the knight, but it is not. This knight is pinned. So it's just a total mess here. So, okay, rook f8 is played, and now, boom, we get our 2 pieces on the 7th rank. Or rook and queen on the 7th, rook over here on the e file, triple attack on this knight. It's looking like we're just going to play rook takes knight, and it's going to be game over. But black comes up with the move rook f7, trying to get rid of our whole 7th rank idea. And this is kind of funny. Queen g8 is played, rook f8 blocks the queen, and here white actually missed the winning sequence. White repeated the position here. White played queen h7, rook f7, queen g8, same exact thing, rook f8, and then here at this point, white figured out how to win this. And great finish here, uses one of the checkmates that we just looked at in the beginning of the chapter. Take your time, look around. Remember, look at all of your checks, see what you can figure out. Pause your video, and we'll be right back. Okay, ready for the solution? If you came up with queen g6, you are correct. Now, this move looks completely insane. The knight can take, the queen can take, but really the knight is pinned. It can't take. And queen takes is met by rook takes knight check, king to d8, and then rook to d7. And we have that same pattern where the king can't move because his rook is sort of blocking his side exit there. So very, very cool finish. All right, next example, we have Lié versus Akopian. And this game we're going to take a look at. Akopian, who was black, was able to get not one, but two rooks on the 7th. And you can see here, I'm saying the 7th, but it's really white's second rank, the pawn rank. And he's got the one rook there already. But he's got to find a way to get his second rook in, and it's not so easy. If he just doubles it up, it's not really so smooth. He won't be able to really bust through the way he wants to. So he comes up with this very, very, very instructive plan. He plays rook to f8, bearing down on the f-file. King goes back to g1, and now very simple f5. Now we had an example from an earlier game where black was trying to open up the files, pawns trading, open up files for the rooks, and white was able to push a pawn. Here, white's pawn on e4 can't push, so he's stuck trading here. There's no way out of this trade. So he takes, rook takes back, and now we're ready for the blind swine, the two rooks on the pawn rank. White checks on b7, black recaptures. Here comes the queen, trying to cause some kind of chaos around the black king, but black's attack is just a bit too strong. So black deals with this with knight c5, which simultaneously hits the queen and also guards this b7 square. Queen captures a5 check, so Akopian's got to stop all of these checks and then his attack will be ready to go. So king to d6, rook comes up to b8 trying to cause some problems, but it's a little too late. Now we have our deadly doubled rooks on the pawn rank, on the 7th rank, or here in this case it's the 2nd rank. Rook d8 check. King goes to e6, sidestep. Here comes the bishop. One more sidestep from the king, king to f6. Now rook hops over to d8, trying very, very, very hard here, but it's just a little bit too late. Rook g2, king f1, rook check. And now we don't have this square blocked off like we'd like to, and we don't have a helper. So how are we going to finish this attack off? How are we going to get this checkmate? After white plays king to e1, see if you can figure out a way to either get a ladder, a back rank checkmate, or one of the checkmates where we box the king in and we don't let him escape. See if you can figure out what Grandmaster Akopian played here to finish this off. Okay, what'd you come up with? If you found the move knight e4, you are correct. Basically, after knight e4, white is forced to resign. Now, he can give another check or two here. Rook h6, king goes to g5, but it's pretty hopeless at this point. Now we have a helper for the rook, so this other rook on g1 is coming down for the back rank checkmate. White can block it. For example, something along these lines could happen. Check. Bishop blocks. Rook captures. Queen captures. But this is pretty much the ball game here. White is completely out of material. So he threw in the towel after the move knight to e4. Very, very precise. Protect the rook, threaten back rank. Nice finish there. Next up, we have Piquet versus Smirin. And we jump right into the action here. Piquet is white, and he's got his rook on the 7th rank, just like we talked about, but problems. Black has just played the move bishop to a6, hitting the white queen. So what is white planning to do here? The queen's under attack. She can retreat. That gives black a little bit of time to sort of solve problems and eliminate the rooks on the 7th rank, maybe with some kind of move to trade them off. We don't want to give black the time to save himself here. So white had to act very, very quickly. He found a wonderful attack here, and this is a very tough one to spot. Take a lot of time on this one. Pause your video now. See if you can figure out what white did to keep his advantage and not retreat. Okay, here we go. So the very surprising queen takes d7 is played in this position. So we're giving up a queen for a bishop and a rook. But more important than that, it's not possible now for black to stop Rooks on the 7th. This rook's coming right in, doubling up, and black is in huge trouble here. So rook d8, let's trade rooks. White says rook e7, let's not. Bishop e2, knight takes pawn on e5. Notice this bishop is pinned. It's not allowed to capture this knight because the black king would be in check. So knight takes e5 is played. Queen a2 trying to come in, but here comes the double up. Rooks on the 7th. And after the move rook g8, how does white close it out here? How does white finish this off? Okay, take a second, pause, see what you can come up with. How do we just close the door here? Here's the winning move. Knight to e8, putting yet another attacker on this bishop on g7. And black has no satisfactory way of saving this bishop, and the attack's going to come crashing through. Now, there could be some kind of back rank check here, but the king will simply sidestep, move on to the h2 square, and he's good to go. So black resigns. Next up, we have Cheparinov versus Alexeyev. And again, we're seeing the same exact pattern. We have one rook on the 7th rank, ready to go. We want to try to get 2 rooks on the 7th. We need to bust through. Take a look at this one. See if you can figure out what white comes up with in this position to seal the deal here. Okay, ready? Queen takes f7 check. Beautiful move. And again, very similar to our last example, he's giving the queen away to get both rooks doubled on the 7th rank. Notice this bishop on c4 holds this rook on f7. The king must leave. Here come the 2 rooks, and there's really no good way to stop the very simple rook h7 checkmate. It's coming. So at this point, black resigned. Okay, next up, we have Movsesian versus Pantsulaya. And in this game, we don't have any rooks on the 7th just yet. We're getting ready. White's got a queen and 2 rooks. 1 rook hits the 7th rank immediately. But okay, nothing to write home about. Black has some moves here. Black plays the move queen e6. So I want to point something out here. White could play rook takes f7 check and get 2 rooks on the 7th right now. But here black would give away the queen for both rooks. And at this point, white I think is still better. I prefer white in this position, but it's not as clear cut. It's not so easy to just checkmate and win this game. So white handled this a little bit differently. So went back a little too far here. Here we go. Rook to d7, get that first rook on the 7th. Queen goes to e6, and now the white queen just doubles up with the rook, protects it, gets ready to play an active role in the attack. Black tries to move rook e8, which was not good enough. And here white is able to find a move just like the last 2 examples, something to help get both rooks on the 7th, get the party started, get the ball rolling. Pause your video, see if you can figure out what white played here. And here we go. The answer. How do we get both rooks on the 7th? Well, this queen is stopping our plan. So white plays the move queen d6 check. And this hits the king and the queen. Simple threat here. If the king moves, we'll just capture the queen. And, well, if rook recaptures, back rank, here we go. No good. And if pawn recaptures, we get our rooks on the 7th, and white is doing very, very well here. In the game, however, black played the move queen takes d6, thinking that white was going to simply recapture here, rook takes d6, but no. 2 rooks on the 7th, and we know this pattern. After king g8, rook g7, king f8, he's blocked by his buddy here. Boom, rook f7, game. Next up, we have Factor versus Carlos Torre. And we saw a little bit of Carlos Torre's work in an earlier chapter. So here, he's back at it, he's black. And here he's playing Factor, who is white. And Factor here smelled blood. He saw that he could open this file, get his rook up to the top of the board. He played the move pawn to d5, which makes sense, but he wasn't really, I think, scared of this queen enough. This queen is on the second rank, and all we need to do is get a little more firepower on the pawn rank here. So Torre just plays rook takes c4, no problem, ignoring this pawn to d5 move. So factor continues, pawn takes e6, getting ready to tear apart the black king side. Black calculated this out very well. He simply doubles up on the pawn rank, and we're threatening a queen next to king with a helper, checkmate on g2. Game over in one move. So here come some checks. Pawn takes f7. The pawn is protected by the queen on b3, so king moves to g7. Promotion. Rook takes. Yet another check. Pawn to e6. But after rook takes b2, there was really nothing left for white to do here. We're threatening both the queen on b3, and we're also threatening queen takes g2. Not really any logical way for white to continue here, so white gave up. All right, next example, we have Sabo versus Duckstein. And in this position here, I think black missed a little chance. Black could have traded rooks at this point. He could have played rook on c8, captures rook on c1, maybe taken away some of the danger of those doubled up rooks. But black played rook to d8, rook c to d8, and this move makes sense because this passed pawn may become a problem later. So black's thinking about that. But now, here come the rooks on the 7th. Rook to e7 is the first start, or the first step here, and the queen is ready to take on g7. It's mate in one. Black solves this problem with rook f6, blocking the queen's path. But now we've got two rooks on the 7th, always dangerous. And at this point, black plays the move pawn to h6. And here's black's thinking. White takes on g7, he gets the pawn, but now black takes on d5, hitting the queen. So this is, just like some of the other games we've seen, very complicated, slugfest. We've got to calculate carefully. So white now gives a series of checks. He starts with rook to h7. And at this point, black could play queen takes rook here. But rather than taking the queen back at this point, white would play queen takes f6 check. This is looking pretty bad here. So king g8 is played. Rook on c goes to g7, king f8, and we don't really have a checkmate just yet. So white does the pull them apart method, spread those rooks out. And now we've got two checkmate threats. We've got rook a8 and rook h8 as possibilities. So here's what black comes up with. King to g8, annoying and harassing the rooks here. Now we can't play rook h8 without being taken by the king. And if we try rook a8, whoops, nobody's protecting your h7 rook. Goodbye. So what does white do? Check. King goes back. And here, white comes up with a really, really nice way of sort of dealing with this. He doesn't want to just keep checking all day long. So he comes up with a way to sort of throw a wrench in the works. Black's got everything controlled. The queen is under attack. This lineup is looking pretty dangerous. So pause your video, think about this for a little bit, see if you can figure out what white's next move will be here. How does white finish this attack off? Okay. Let's see if you found this move. This is a super difficult move to find. Rook on g to f7. What on earth is happening here? Well, number one, we are pinning this f6 rook. Very important. This f6 rook cannot move off of this diagonal here. Now, if black decides to take the queen, well, what do we do now? Rook a8 check, and black has a couple of blocking moves, but none of them will work. Queen c8, we just capture. Rook d8, same exact thing. And we see the beauty of this rook f7 move. It stops this battery here. It stops this lined up queen and rook from coming to the defense of the black king. So black is just stuck. And there isn't much else that he can do here. Now that this rook is pinned, it can't help. Queen takes f2, we just take right back, no problem. And there's really nothing to be done after rook on g to f7. So black throws in the towel, gives up, and we're on to our next example. So we have Beer versus Blackburn here. And in this position, black has just played the move rook captures on d5. And here white says, okay, the 7th rank is open. Here we go. Rook to b7, check. And black very wisely thinks, okay, I need to stop this attack. Let me block this. And he goes back with this rook. The rook on d5 goes to d7. And this is one of those cases where black just picked the wrong rook, because white has a really beautiful move that he can play here that totally destroys everything that black is trying to do. So let's pause, see if you can find it. A really nice move for white to play and take advantage of black's awkward position. So here's what he does. Instead of doing something to protect this rook on b7, he just abandons it and plays the move queen to e6, threatening the rook on d7 with two attackers and also threatening the pawn on f6. So rook captures, queen captures on f6, and now king g8 is forced. Here, a series of very, very nice checks. Queen takes pawn on g5 first, open up the king a little more, force him into the corner. Now we pick up the rook on d8, we take that guy with check as well. King goes to g7. Hey, we're back on f6. Same idea, but we've picked up the pawn and the rook first. King goes to g8, and now rook d3. Rook is just heading all the way up to the top of the board looking for a back rank style checkmate. So rook to b8 is played. And now you can probably guess where this rook goes. Now that the 8th rank is covered, we go rook d7, and it's very difficult to stop what's coming. Queen to f8. We had to prevent queen to g7, but now on queen g5, king h8, the king gets hit along the diagonal with queen takes e5, and after king g8 and queen h5, there's no really great way to stop queen takes h7. So black resigns. Another victim of the 7th rank rooks. All right, the last two positions that I have in this chapter are all world champion versus world champion. So the first one here is Mikhail Botvinnik and Max Euwe. So these guys were both at some point world champions. This is a very famous position. And here, black, Max Euwe, plays the move f6, hitting that knight in the center. That knight is a very annoying piece. It makes sense to try to get rid of him. But here, Botvinnik thought for a while, and he was able to figure out a really great way to get two pieces on the 7th rank. So here are only two pieces are the queen and the rook. So you know it's going to have something to do with those two guys. So how do we get queen and rook on the 7th rank here in a really nice, strong forcing manner? Take a little time, try to plan it out, see if you can make those guys invade the 7th rank. It's pretty tricky, but you can do it. Okay, let's see how world champion Mikhail Botvinnik figured out this method of getting rook and queen on the 7th rank. So he starts with queen g3. He doesn't bother saving the knight, and he's threatening to just drop the queen on g7. And this is such a strong move that he's willing to give his knight up for it. So here, after pawn takes knight on e5, queen goes to g7, and now the rook on h8 is in trouble. So in order to save that rook, we've got to move it to f8, and here come the rook and queen. And they're just too strong on the 7th rank. There's no way to stop queen d7 and queen e7 mate without giving up the queen. So this is what world champion Max Euwe did. He gave his queen away to stop the double up on the 7th rank, but he went on to lose this game in a few more moves. We'll just take a look at the rest of the moves. White takes a pawn here. The bishop and rook working together, I mean, if we know the point value, 3 plus 5 is 8, and there's a passed pawn here. So, you know, black is right in trying to play on and seeing if he can find some way to win this or draw this. But the queen just ends up being too strong here. Queen e3, bishop c4, trying to keep hold of that passed pawn, but be gone, bishop. Rook comes down, and rather than taking right away, f3 is played, getting the king a little closer to the action. Queen blocks the passed pawn. Finally, he takes the bishop, but now there are two connected passed pawns, and we've got to be careful. These guys can promote. So the king comes over to help. King f7, king e3, and at this point, after rook c7, and the king gets in the way of those pawns, there's not really a great way for black to continue here. And after rook c6, pawn to a4, black resigns. And I did want to point out that if black did decide to check here and start sending these pawns down the board, white always has the option of just sacrificing the queen because he's up by so many pawns, and this would be a very easy endgame for white to win. He's got the passed pawn on the A file, and by the time the king stops that pawn, white will just basically collect every single one of these pawns here. So, no dice. So after these final moves here, rook c6 and a4, black gave it up. And our final example for this chapter, another world champion versus world champion matchup, Jose Raul Capablanca versus Alexander Alekhine. And here, Capablanca was able to launch an attack on the 7th rank, and he starts immediately, rook h7, one piece on the 7th rank. And Alekhine decided to just abandon ship here, run the king to the other side of the board, but it didn't end up working. Queen takes g7. Now we're doubled up, but there's a pawn in our path, so it's not over yet. King d8, bishop takes, pawn takes, and now queen takes b7. So we have them spread out. We're looking for checkmates. Queen b4 check. Trade that queen with a check. Take away some of the pressure. Super logical move. Makes total sense. But unfortunately for black, there's still a way for white to get that 7th rank domination here. Pawn c5 is played. Now this move isn't so much about attacking the rook. It's more about opening this rook on e4 up for further adventures. Rook c6, rook takes on b4. And now we have some 7th rank domination coming up after rook takes c5. Rook to a7. What is going on here? Very interesting move. It looks like we could have just doubled up immediately, but rook to a7 is pretty sneaky. What he's planning to do here is just play rook to b8 check. So let's give black just some random move. Pawn to e5. Rook to b8 check. Rook up. Takes, takes, check. And grab that rook if he runs to the left side. If he plays king e7, guards the rook. Better, but he's down 3 pawns to 1, and it's game over. So after the move, let me head back here. After the move rook to a7, black had enough, and he resigns. So hopefully now you see the power of the 2 rooks on the 7th rank. Tons of examples. This is a great way to get a huge advantage in your games. I'll see you in the next chapter. All right, we're on chapter 5, the Greek gift. So the Greek gift, of course, is a reference to the Trojan horse with the Greek soldiers stored inside of it. A gift that you give that's not really a gift. It's a trick, it's a trap. And this position is no different. So the Greek gift involves bishop, knight, and queen usually. And a very kind of basic example of this, you'll see in the diagram, you play bishop to h7, you sacrifice the bishop, and the idea is that you do everything with check, or as much as possible. Now, after the king takes the bishop, we play knight to g5 check. And the king has a couple of options here. He can move forward to g6 or h6, usually pretty dangerous to do that, but sometimes necessary to survive. Here, we're going to look at king g8, and then queen h5. Usually we'll just finish the game off here. We're threatening queen to h7. This is the basic bare bones pattern of the Greek gift. Another variation on this. It's actually very strong if you have this pawn on h4. So here really the only difference is we have this h pawn. And what this does is after bishop h7, king takes h7. That's our Greek gift, our Trojan horse. Not really a gift. It's just there to break down the walls. Knight to g5 check. And now we see why this pawn on h4 is so useful. If bishop takes, we can take with the pawn and make a discovery with this rook. And the rook helps this attack tremendously. You'll see this in a lot of examples. If the king retreats, well, okay. Now we play queen h5. And similarly, bishop takes, getting rid of that defender of the queen. Okay, we take back, and now we have queen h7 or queen h8 coming up. The only way to stop this, move that f pawn, And now this pawn that was on h4, that's now on g5, gets to be the hero of the show here. Pawn to g6. If we rush and we play something like queen h8 right now, goodbye, king to f7, and he might get away. So we lock him in with this pawn to g6 move. We don't allow the king to escape, and now there's nothing to do. Rook e8, queen h8 is checkmate, game. So this is the pattern. We're going to take a look at a bunch of master games where this exact pattern occurs. Let's jump right in with a super old example from the 1600s. This is Greco versus No Name. And we've seen our friend No Name before. I'm going to show you this whole game because it's a pretty short one. e4, e6. This is the French defense. Now, the Greek gift can happen a lot in the French defense because there's no pawn on e5. There's no black pawn on e5 to block our e-pawn. So if we get this e-pawn out of the way, the b1 h7 diagonal opens up. So there's a lot of opportunities for the Greek gift here. Pawn to d4, knight f6, bishop d3, develop your pieces, knight c6, and develop. Bring those pieces outside. Bishop e7, all good moves. h4. Now, I don't recommend playing h4 right here. You should probably continue developing your pieces, but here white, was trying to trick his opponent. This is not really a super strong move to play right now, though. Castles, and now e5 opens up that diagonal, and we're getting ready, after knight d5, see if you can calculate the finish of this game. Take a little time, see what you can come up with. We've seen the pattern, make it work in an actual game. Okay, ready? We have bishop takes h7 check, very straightforward. Now, the king doesn't have to take this bishop. He can move over, but then we would continue on with the same idea, and we haven't lost our bishop. So for example, knight g5, queen h5 is coming, and we get to hold on to this bishop. So our attack is even better. So here black figures, okay, I might as well grab this piece. Here comes knight g5, bishop takes. We've seen this before. Pawn takes on g5, opening up that rook. King retreats. Here comes queenie. Pawn to f5, trying to run away. And do you remember what we need to play here to make sure that king stays locked in place? Pawn g6. And that's that. Rook e8, queen h8, ball game over. Next example, our buddy No Name is back. This is Efim Bogolyubov. He's white, No Name is black. Again, we have another position that came out of the French defense. Black has no pawn on e5, so this gives us some chances to make these type of things work. So here white plays pawn to e5, hitting the knight. The knight retreats, goes back to d7, and here comes our friend, the h-pawn, to help out with this attack. So okay, black doesn't sense the danger here. He castles. Here comes bishop d3, basically just pointing that bishop at the h7 pawn, getting ready to go. Pawn to c5 is played. Knight h3 takes. And here we want to get our Greek gift idea to work, but some of the squares are blocked. Some of the pieces are sort of in the way of each other. So take a little time here, pause your video. How do we get the Greek gift to work in this position? Very similar to the last one. We just have to clean up the board a little. Okay, ready? Here is what white does. He wants to play bishop h7 check, king takes h7, and knight to g5, but there's a bishop on g5, so what do? We just get that bishop out of there with a somewhat forcing move. We trade. We take the bishop and attack the queen. Black takes back, and now we're ready to launch our Greek gift. King takes, queen h5 check, king g8, knight g5, and the threat is queen to h7 checkmate. And here black didn't find any way out of this. He basically just resigned at this point. Next, we have Fritz versus Mason. And another very, very similar example. This should look really, really clear. Take some time, try to find what happens in this position. Okay, so bishop h7, king h7, knight g5. Once again, same idea, but in this game, we're gonna see the king run out. Black knew at this point, okay, if I go back to g8, it's queen h5, the bishop will take the knight, the pawn will take back, and this should look super duper familiar. Pawn f5, pawn g6, here we go. So black noticed all of that and decided, okay, let's play king g6. Prove that you can win this game. So here, knight to e2, bringing in the knight, getting ready to check on f4. Bishop takes, trying to get rid of some of the attackers, makes total sense. Pawn takes, now we have a rook on the h-file. Pawn to f5, trying to give the king a little escape square here, but en passant. Remember, anytime a pawn moves 2 steps, you should think about en passant. If you have a pawn next to it, side by side with it at the end of the move, you can capture it as though it only moved 1 step. Rook h8, fighting for the h-file, but let's throw a check in. Knight to f4 check. King moves up to f7, and now here comes a very, very interesting move. Queen g4. He says, take my rook and take it with check. I don't care. Rook takes, king d2, and now, very, very problematic. If he takes this rook, if he goes and grabs another rook, well, after queen to g7 check, king to e8, there are some problems here. Pawn check, king moves, oh, let's say d7, and now we have our old friend discovered check coming on. And now we have 2 queens, and we are in great shape here. The attack will continue. So black elected to take 1 rook with check, and then play pawn takes f6, trying to solve the problem like that. But the queen and knight combined are very strong. Knight defends the queen. Queen takes e6, king to g7, and now rook takes rook, and just too much power. Bishop c8, trying to get rid of that queen. And a great finish here. Pause your video, see if you can figure out how white gets a forced mate here. Remember, always look at every single check in the position. Okay, did you find it? It's a very, very nice one. Rook h7 check. So here, black's got a couple of choices. He can take the rook, or he can run away. If he runs away, we simply play queen f7, queen next to king with a helper. More interesting is if he takes the rook, we're running out of material, but the queen and the knight are really all you need to finish this off. Queen f7 check. The king can move up or down, h8 or h6, doesn't matter. King h6, queen next to king with a helper, that knight, so nice. King h8, knight g6 is checkmate. Nothing for black to do here. Very, very nice finish by Mr. Fritz. Next up, we've got Blackburn versus Muller. So here, we already have our setup prepared. The pawn is out of our way. The bishop's ready to go. But in this position, Blackburn felt like he couldn't quite make the Greek gift work just yet. Bishop h7, king h7, knight g5 check. There's a little problem. Take a look. Check, takes, check. Whoops. Black has 2 attackers here ready to grab that guy. So our friend the h-pawn comes in. And here, black plays f6. So black knew what was coming here. Black could sense the danger. White plays knight g5 anyway, though. So now, after pawn takes knight, here come the fireworks. Bishop takes h7 check. King takes h7. Pawn takes pawn check. And after king g8, pause your video, see what you can find here. There's a really nice finish to this checkmate. Okay, check this out. Rook to h8 check. Now, surprisingly here, if the king played to f7, he would actually be able to survive this attack. And white actually has a lot of work to do in this position. But he grabbed the rook. And now after queen h5 check, king g8, well, our queen has no helper. How do we solve that problem? Pawn to g6. Rook f5 is tried, but queen h7, king f8, and now back rank fiesta. Queen h8 is checkmate. Game. And we're on to the next. Back to our old friend, Alexander Aliekin, world champion. He's playing against T. Lovewell in this game. And here in this position, we have the bishop moving to d3, getting ready for this attack. The knight takes on f4, pawn takes back, rook e8 is played, and I bet you can figure out the entire combination at this point. Take a little time. How does our world champion friend Alexander Aliekin finish this off? So if you came up with bishop h7 check, you are correct. After king takes, we have the same idea, knight g5. This time we have no h-pawn, but we have an f-pawn guarding the knight, so there's no queen takes knight to worry about. King moves to g8, and after queen h5, black actually played a move and then resigned. And he realized he was going to have a ton of problems here with queen h7, king f8, queen h8 check, king e7, queen takes g7 check, and the hits keep on coming here. So he gave up after he made his final move here, f6. Next up, another world champion, Boris Spassky versus Efim Geller. So Boris Spassky was world champion at this point, and he has a similar finish to this game here. So let me get to our spot. Pawn takes pawn is played. And now we want to do the Greek gift here, but we have some problems. There's no bishop takes h7. Knight g5 isn't going to work. So Spassky had to figure out a way to make this entire thing work here. And look at what he does. He plays pawn g5. So first things first, let's remove that bishop. Let's get him out of there. Bishop e7, and now he plays pawn e5. Let's open up this b1 h7 diagonal. Bishop f8 is played. And well, we still don't have this square for our knight. So what does Spassky do here? He continues the attack with bishop h7 anyway. King takes h7, and now how do we play knight g5? Well, we just vacate that square. Pawn g6 check, and the g5 square is open for business. King goes back. Here comes knight g5, hitting this f7 pawn a second time. F takes g6 is played. And now queen to f3. We can't play queen h5 like we'd like to. So next best option, queen f3, threatens queen f7 check. Queen takes knight. This is what black came up with. I mean, there's really not much else that can be done to stop all of these attacks. There's also queen h3, queen h7. So it's just so deadly here. Queen takes knight is played. And Spassky went on to win this game after bishop takes queen. And he used his extra material to just finish it off. A couple more examples. More modern game. We have Gatakomsky versus Sam Shankland. And take a look at this one. This is a really, really interesting example. Black is looking very solid in this position. Black's got the queen, bishop, and knight developed. Very strong pawns in the center. Everything's looking fine here. And black is not at all worried about the Greek gift because, number one, there's no knight g5 check coming at any point. And number two, there's no pawn to h4. So it just looks like white has no chance of making the Greek gift work. But watch this. After bishop takes h7 check, king takes, queen h5, the king moves back to g8. And now all of a sudden, we can play the move knight to g5 check. So take your time here. Pause your video, see if you can find the right answer, the right way to get that knight to g5. Okay, ready? So if you said knight f3, good thinking, but it's just too slow. After knight f3, this gives black a chance to defend, maybe move one of these pawns, maybe get the queen back there to help. But the move here, knight e4, came as a very big surprise, and I think this is probably what black missed. If pawn captures on e4, queen takes queen. So that knight will get to go to g5. It hits this queen. The queen needs to move. And now knight g5 comes in, threatening queen takes h7. The only way to avoid checkmate here is to move the f rook. But now the f pawn is unprotected. Queen takes f7 check. Uh-oh. King goes to h8, queen back to h5, king g8, and now rook to d1. This looks like a super slow move here, but the idea is very simple. Let's just move the rook up. Eventually get up, get over. Once we can move this knight, rook to d4 can become a thing here. e5 is played. Now queen f7 check, king h8, and check out this move here, e4. Trying very hard to open up this file, get the rook in, finish off the attack. Notice if pawn takes e4, queen captures queen on c4. And queen takes e4 is no good either, the knight's protecting. So black tries knight e7, trying to get some kind of counterplay here. Queen takes, and now bishop b5. Really, really sneaky. This is how you have to play if you're in trouble, if you're losing. He gives up this piece, but now he's got this battery and he's threatening queen e2 checkmate. Queen next to king with a helper. So rook d2 needs to be played here. Queen takes pawn on a2. Now maybe we can make some back rank threats. So black's looking like he's getting in, but queen f7 very calmly played. Queen check on the back rank. Rook blocks it. Queen takes a pawn. Hey, I'm back to my queen next to king with a helper checkmate. Watch out. Black's not done. But queen h5 check is played. King g8. Queen h7 check. King f8. And now we get back on h8 and that king's going for a little walk. King to e7. Queen takes g7 check. King to d6. And rook takes d5. And that king is in tremendous danger here. Rook c6. And after king f6, well, Shankland had enough at this point and he resigns. Really brilliant performance. It looked like there was no chance of getting that Greek gift to go through, but Kamsky made it work. And here, our last example, I've actually included a game where the Greek gift doesn't work. So it's kind of a funny example. This is Quinteros versus Sarawan. And in this game, white plays a Greek gift attack, but he misses a couple of key ideas and the attack sort of peters out and black ends up winning the game. So just because you see a Greek gift doesn't mean you have to play it. You need to kind of plan these things out. Just make sure you're not giving your opponent any way to escape. So let's take a look. Pawn to e5 is played. At this point, black plays knight d5, and now there's no knight in the neighborhood to guard this square. So that's a very, very big part of this Greek gift situation. You don't want to allow the knights to come back and protect the h7 square. Bishop takes h7, king takes h7, knight g5 check. And we've seen this before. And at this point here, black plays the move king to g6. And here, white needed to continue with some pawns here, believe it or not. A pawn attack would have sort of sealed the deal here. Pawn f4, and then that gives room for the rook to come in. This would have made the attack work out a little bit better, but let's watch what happened here. Let's see how black survives this. Queen g4, very, very threatening move here. We're setting up discoveries. We're ready to attack that black king. f5 is played. Queen to g3. f4 is played, harassing the queen, trying to prevent any problems. Remember, if you make a discovery, not a double check, a discovery, if this knight moves, you can still lose your queen. Even though the queen is checking the king with a discovery, it doesn't mean that your queen is off limits. They can take the queen and end the check. So be careful. Queen moves to h3. Here comes the other knight, basically giving back the piece that was sacrificed. He doesn't take it. Pawn takes. And now, finally, black gives back the material. White is back to even here. But the attack is pretty much over. And black tries to trade queens, just defend the king, and this passed pawn on d4 ends up being a very big headache for white. So we just put a rook behind the passed pawn, and all of a sudden, black is winning. And we can see the final moves of the game here. Trade queens. Rook on the 7th rank, looks familiar. Pawn h5 check, king takes. He wants to get rid of that rook, but now pawn f3 solidifies the rook on e2. And notice this move is not possible because now the rook on d2 is not protected. So he takes on d4, and after the move rook to g5 check, white gives up here. So a nice, interesting example of when not to do the Greek gift. Just because it's there doesn't mean it's guaranteed to work. You have to plan these things out. You have to make sure you've calculated everything carefully. I'll see you in the next chapter.